The wind howled down from the mesa like it had teeth. Tavian Natani held the reins tighter, his knuckles white against the worn leather, as his horse skidded along the icy ridge. The snow hadn't come, but the sky promised it. Low and gray, heavy with silence. His coat flapped open despite the buttons, and the cold bit through to his chest, like it meant to remind him he was still breathing. Below the land stretched wide and pale sagebrush and stone scrub pines, clinging to the red earth like survivors. Tavian leaned forward in the saddle, urging the animal down a steep slope. He hadn't meant to be this far from the road, but he'd seen the vultures circling. Something was dead or dying. They came into view, fast, a cow on her side and the arroyo legs twitching weakly. Two younger calves stood nearby, confused, calling low. Tavian dismounted before the horse stopped moving, boots skidding in the dust. Heart thudding not from fear, but from something older, deeper recognition. The cow's eyes were rolled halfway back, tongue dry and cracked. Poison disease. Her flank heaved, shallow, erratic. He knelt and touched the animal gently near the shoulder. Skin hot and taut. She was burning alive from the inside. He looked up, scanning the empty hills. No one. No help. Just the wind and the sky and this life slipping away in his hands. "I don't have anything for you," he murmured. "I didn't bring a damn thing." The cow shuddered once and went still. Tavian closed his eyes. The breath left him slow. Not just for the cow. Not just for the helplessness. But because he'd felt that same heat before at Ailani's side the night she died, when nothing he did was enough. He stood up too fast, the world pitching. The two calves watched him, still unsure, still waiting for someone to explain what was happening. He turned away. There was nothing else to do. The wind cut across his face sharp as a blade, and he pulled his scarf up, heading back to the road. As he rode, he pulled the envelope from his coat, creased, stained, too heavy for what it contained. The letter had arrived a week ago, handed to him by a boy at a rail camp. To Tavian Nataani Ray estate of Jeremiah Nez. He hadn't opened it right away. Didn't care about paperwork. Most days he didn't care if he made it past sunset. But on the third night, staring at the fire with Ailani's journal open on his knees, he'd read the letter, and something in it had stuck. An inheritance. A piece of land near White Mesa. A ranch his great-uncle had left behind. Tavian had only met him once as a boy. The old man had smelled like horses and cedar smoke, said little, laughed less. But he'd given Tavian a carved wooden horse that day, and for years Tavian had kept it on his shelf until it burned with everything else in the fire that took his wife. He looked again at the calves behind him, still not moving. Waiting. That night, under a frozen sky, Tavian built a fire out of dry willow and sat cross-legged beside it. He read Ailani's journal again, words she'd written in the last months, when her cough was worse, when the sickness lived under her skin like something coiled and patient. If we ever get land of our own, she'd written, I want it to be a place for healing. For animals too old to sell. For people with nowhere to go. The kind of place that waits for the broken and doesn't ask questions. He'd read that line 100 times before, but this time it held weight. Not just hope, but direction. The next morning, he saddled his mare and rode south. 3 days later, he crossed into Montezuma County under a sky smeared in ash and gold. The land grew wilder out here, the roads thinner, fewer signs, more silence. He passed a stone pillar with faded lettering, White Mesa Reserve. Further on, an old barbed wire fence ran along the ridge, sagging, broken in places, but still holding its shape. The directions were simple. 14 miles north of Cortez. Look for the black iron gate with the horse heads. It sounded like a dream or a lie. Tavian had seen too many ranches gone to seed, left to weather, and ruins scattered with bones. But there it was. The iron gate stood crooked in the earth, flanked by leaning fence posts, the hinges covered in rust. Twin horse heads faced inward at the top of the arch. The words, "Black Timber Sanctuary," were barely visible in the flaked paint. Tavian dismounted. The wind had gone still. No birds, no movement, just the hollow sound of the gate creaking as he pushed it open. The ground inside was hard-packed dirt and dry tufts of grass. An old wagon sat half-buried by wind-blown dust. The ranch house was visible up the hill, weathered porch, sagging windows, cloudy. He stepped past the gate and stopped cold. A sound carried through the stillness, a low, sharp whinny, then another. Not just one animal, multiple, echoing. He turned. Over the ridge they came slowly into view. 3 horses, lean but standing. A few yards behind them, a scattering of sheep, then cows, dozens of them. Thin, hollow-flanked, but alive. They moved in loose groups, watching him. One horse stepped forward, gray around the muzzle with clouded eyes but steady legs. She walked to the edge of the fence line and stopped, waiting. Tavian felt his breath catch. She looked like the mare Ilani used to ride. Not the same, but close enough to twist something in his chest. He moved slowly, crossing the dirt. "Hey, girl," he said, voice low. "You waiting for someone?" She blinked, took a step forward. Let him touch her. Tavian swallowed. The warmth under his hand felt impossibly real. She didn't flinch, didn't shy. Behind her, the herd stood still quiet, watching. He turned in a slow circle. The ranch wasn't empty. It had been surviving. These animals weren't lost. They were waiting. He looked at his hand on the mare's neck, looked back toward the silent house on the hill. The air pressed against him like a question. And for the first time in months, Tavian didn't turn away. The land hadn't given up. It had just gone quiet, waiting for someone to listen. The wind picked up again, curling around Tavian as he stood by the old gray mare. Dust skittered across the packed earth, gathering in corners like secrets. The air had that strange kind of silence too, still too watchful, as if the ranch itself was holding its breath. The mare nudged his arm with her nose. Her eyes were clouded but clear enough to see him, and she didn't look away. Tavian let his hand rest on her cheek. There was heat there, life, but she was thin like the rest. A life stretched too far. Behind them, the other animals lingered on the edge of the clearing. A small herd of sheep, several cows with ribs sharp beneath their hides, a handful of chickens pecking in the dust, like they'd forgotten how to hope for more. Tavian turned eyes, scanning the buildings. The barn leaned southward, the roof half collapsed on one side. The house stood farther up the slope, its wood silvered with time. One shutter hung at an angle like it had given up trying to stay straight. The mare followed as he moved forward, her hooves soft in the dirt. She didn't crowd him, just stayed close enough to be known. Tavian passed a half-cracked water trough and bent to check inside. A thin layer of algae floated at the surface, but there was still water, fresh enough cold. He dipped his fingers and tasted it. Not spoiled. He stood and looked around again. Someone had been here recently. Maybe not today. Maybe not even this week. But the signs were everywhere if you knew how to see them. Salt blocks tucked under the shade of a gnarled cedar. Feed bags inside an old cart tied closed against pests. The fence nearest the barn had been patched with rope and metal wire, haphazard but intentional. He felt it in his gut, same way he used to feel a horse's weight in the saddle or the weather coming long before the sky changed. This wasn't abandonment. This was endurance. The mare nudged his shoulder again, then turned, walking toward the barn without a backward glance. Tavian hesitated, then followed. The door groaned when he pushed it open. Inside, the light filtered through cracked boards and angled shafts, revealing dust motes and old wood and the low hum of waiting. It smelled like hay and damp leather and something older. Memory, maybe. The mare stepped in behind him, hooves clacking softly against the floor. To the left, several empty stalls. To the right, a half-covered stack of feed barrels. He moved slowly, scanning, listening. Then he saw it nailed beside the main door to the tack room, a ledger. Old leather-bound, a thin strap of hide wrapped around it. He pulled it down gently and untied it. Inside, the handwriting was crooked, shaky, but careful. April 2nd, Belle colicked again, but drank willow bark tea. Check her on the 5th. April 12th, feed almost gone. Burned sage to keep spirits calm. April 19th, 2 calves born in the night. Both breathing, 1 week. May Vern, I can't stay much longer. Chest is tight again. Eyes blur in the morning. Tavian's fingers tightened on the leather. Whoever wrote this hadn't just taken care, they'd fought to keep these animals alive. This wasn't just habit. It was love. Duty. His throat tightened. He turned the page and found more entries, feed logs, birth records, notes about repairs. A name appeared more than once in the margins, Miguel T.B., Miguel 10 Bears. Tavian remembered the name. An old friend of his great-uncle's. Used to come down to Shiprock during gatherings. A quiet man with eyes like storm clouds. He would have been well into his 70s by now. So Miguel had stayed. All this time. Long after anyone else would have left. And now gone. Tavian didn't know if he died here or walked away. But either way, the ranch hadn't been alone. He stepped back outside. The sky had shifted. The color gone from gold to steel. A storm coming not tonight, maybe, but soon. He could smell it in the wind. Bitter and sharp. He looked back toward the house. The porch sagged under its own weight, and the front door hung slightly ajar. The yard was full of broken tools, an old rocking chair tipped on its side, and weeds tall enough to hide a child. Tavian hesitated at the steps. The marebell, he guessed, stood at the edge of the porch and watched him, head tilted slightly. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stale with dust and dry wood. It smelled like time had folded itself here, layer upon layer. The floor creaked under his boots. A fireplace on the far wall still held half-burned logs. A worn rug covered the center of the room, faded in the middle, the pattern barely visible. There was a photo on the wall, black and white, curling at the edges. A man stood beside a small boy. Both were looking at something off-camera. The boy couldn't have been more than 8. Tavian stared at it for a long moment. That was him. He remembered the visit now. The long ride up, the silence, the weight of the land pressing in. His great-uncle had barely spoken, but he'd handed Tavian that carved horse, then let him brush down a mule out back. No words. Just space. Now the space was his. Tavian crossed the room, opened a narrow cabinet. Inside, old cans, a rusted tin of coffee, a half-used candle. Nothing fresh. No recent food. Miguel hadn't lived in the house. He turned slowly, eyes drifting toward the window. Beyond it, the land stretched out wide, untamed. The herd had gathered near the barn, now quiet still, as if waiting again. He let out a long breath and sat on the edge of the old rocking chair. It creaked under him, but held. He pulled Ilani's journal from his coat, opened it to a page near the back. The land doesn't forget the hands that care for it. It only waits. Quietly. Patiently. It waits until it knows you're ready to come home. He didn't cry. Not yet. But the ache was there, sharp and dull all at once. He looked down at his boots caked in red dust, then back toward the barn. Somebody had fed them, watered them, patched fences with tired hands. And now they were his. Outside, Belle raised her head and whinnied again, low and firm, like a bell struck once in a quiet church. Tavian stood. He didn't know what he was doing, but he knew this much: the ranch wasn't dead. It was waiting, and now so was he. They weren't abandoned, they were enduring. Tavian woke to the sound of movement, slow, deliberate hoofbeats shifting over the hard ground. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Then he saw the warped ceiling of the ranch house above him, the way the dawn light filtered in through the uneven boards of the window frame. He sat up stiffly from the couch he'd collapsed on the night before, shoulders aching from a sleep that hadn't been restful. His coat was still on his boots, tracked dust across the floor. A tin cup sat by the cold hearth, half full of rainwater he'd gathered from a broken barrel outside. The hoofbeats continued close. Not a stampede, a walk, steady and patient. He stepped out onto the porch. Belle stood at the bottom of the steps, head-high, ears forward. The rest of the herd was behind her, more horses now, maybe 7 or 8 in total. A few cows clustered near the broken fence line. 2 calves suckled noisily while the others stood watch. The sheep were scattered across the yard, pulling at patches of stubborn grass. None of them made noise. They didn't cry, didn't stamp or spook. They just looked at him. Tavian exhaled slowly and stepped down. The cold bit at his fingers. He rubbed his hands together and moved toward the barn. They followed, not in a rush, not aggressively, just with quiet intention. By the time he reached the barn, he could feel their presence behind him, more than a dozen animals now forming a loose arc. He felt like a stone dropped in still water. Everything reacted to him. Watched, waited. The inside of the barn was dim, but Tavian had left the door propped open the night before. He moved to the barrels, opened one, empty. The second one had a handful of cracked corn and dust. The third was better, about a quarter full of feed pellets that had kept dry somehow. He dipped his hand in and let the grain run through his fingers. Still good. He pulled an old tin scoop from a nail on the wall and began to portion it out into a half-collapsed trough just outside the door. The noise brought them in. Belle came first, steady and calm, nudging her way to the front, but not forcing it. The others followed in a quiet shuffle. Tavian stood back and watched them eat, their jaws working with a slow, familiar rhythm. He could hear their breathing, the crackle of hooves over dry earth, the low shuffle of movement, like the sound of old fabric. A smaller horse, a bay with a torn ear and ribs like fence posts, moved tentatively around the edge of the group. He stepped in to keep the others from crowding her and tossed feed into a separate corner of the trough. She met his eyes once, then dipped her head. He looked around, measuring. There were more animals than he could count in a glance. Horses, cows, chickens wandering between hooves like they'd learned long ago not to be afraid. Even a goat lingered near the water trough, chewing on a piece of rope. They weren't starving. Thin, yes, worn down, but not skeletal, not panicked. They had been surviving. He turned back into the barn. A stack of old wooden crates leaned against the far wall. Tavian pried one open and found a mess of old tools, wire cutters, rusted nails, scraps of fencing. In another, a few sealed glass jars with oats, brittle but clean. On a narrow shelf sat another notebook, spiral-bound pages curled at the edges. Inside were more of Miguel's notes. The handwriting was worse here, shaking more slanted downward. Fed Belle first today. Always calm when she eats first. Red cow limping again. Might be her back leg. Fixed east gate barely. Rope holding, but not for long. Chest tight again. Hard to breathe after morning rounds. Left water at all troughs. If someone finds this, check the pens near the creek. Tavian stared at the last line. It wasn't just about care. It was guidance. Miguel hadn't walked away blindly. He'd known he was leaving this behind. He pushed open the tack room door. Dust exploded in the air, catching the sunlight through a crack in the roof. Saddles slumped on pegs, stiff with disuse. Old blankets, some chewed at the edges. And in the corner, a small cedar box with a brass latch. Inside, medicine bottles. Some dried-out labels faded, but a few still intact liniment for swelling a tin of salve and strips of clean cloth wound tight. He gathered what was still good and moved back outside. A few cows had begun to wander, but most still lingered near the barn. He spotted the red cow in question, a lean animal with a stiff gait and a raw patch near her rear leg. She blinked slowly when he approached. Tavian worked quietly, kneeling beside her, speaking low in Diné as he cleaned the wound. She didn't fight him, barely shifted her weight. He smeared the salve and wrapped the leg with the cloth, tying it firm. His knees ached when he stood again, but something in his chest had loosened. He didn't feel right yet. Not whole, but less empty. He glanced toward the house, then back at the barn. There was a rhythm here, a system, rough, improvised, but functional. Miguel had built it alone, maintained it long past his strength. The thought sat heavy. Belle stood near the side of the barn, now watching. Her breath steamed in the morning light. Tavian walked over and ran a hand down her flank. She shifted, then leaned into it. "You kept them steady," he said quietly. "Didn't you?" She blinked, slow and sure. The wind stirred the dust again, tugging at the door Tavian hadn't noticed before, small set into the side of the barn, half covered by a leaning gate panel. He walked over, pulled it open. A narrow path ran out behind the barn, marked with hoof prints and paw tracks leading down a slope toward the creek bed. Tavian followed it. It took 10 minutes to reach the bottom, where a half-broken wooden fence bordered a small clearing. A pen had once stood here, now mostly fallen. Inside, the remains of bedding straw, a broken water trough, and bones. Small ones. A fox's den had taken up in one corner. He knelt. There were newer tracks here, animal and human. Boots. Narrow. Not more than a few weeks old. Miguel had been here. Likely spent his last weeks rotating between this lower pen and the upper yard, trying to hold it all together. Tavian stood slowly, scanning the hills. Something moved near the tree line. A figure far off. He couldn't see a face, but he saw a woman's shape. Not running. Not hiding. Just standing. Watching. Then she turned and disappeared between the piñon trees. Tavian stood for a long time, eyes fixed on the place where she'd been. Belle called softly from the ridge above, and Tavian turned back toward the barn, the mare, the waiting herd, and the weight of something just beginning. "I kept the promise as long as I could. Now it's your turn." The light was fading by the time Tavian reached the base of the slope again. The last blush of sun filtered through the clouds, painting the land in deep golds and long shadows. Belle waited at the crest, her ears twitching as he approached. She didn't make a sound, but she turned when he reached her, leading the way without a backward glance. He followed. They walked in silence past the barn and the cracked water trough, past the pens and the sagging gates, up a path overgrown with weeds that curled around old footprints. Tavian hadn't seen this trail before, not clearly, but now it seemed obvious, like it had always been there, waiting for someone who finally knew where to look. The wind shifted, pine mixed with smoke. Somewhere an owl called low and lonely, The trail led to a small grove of trees tucked against the hillside. Hidden behind a thicket of juniper and piñon pine stood a cabin no bigger than a wagon shed. Its roof was intact, but moss had taken root in the shingles, and the windows were covered with faded cloth pinned at the corners with old nails. A clothesline hung limp across the porch, one tattered shirt still fluttering like a forgotten prayer. Tavian stepped up carefully. The wood groaned beneath his boots. The door was cracked open. He pushed it with the back of his hand. Inside was silence and the sharp scent of cedar and dust. The room was small, barely enough space for a bed, a cast-iron stove, and a wooden table covered with neat stacks of paper. A worn flannel blanket was folded at the foot of the bed. A lantern sat on the table, wick trimmed full. But what drew Tavian's eye was the envelope in the center of the table. It had his name on it. He reached for it slowly, his chest tightening, then sank into the wooden chair beside the table. The air in the room felt heavy, like it had been holding its breath for weeks. He broke the seal with a calloused thumb. Tavian. If you're reading this, then I'm either dead or too sick to stay. Either way, the ranch is yours now, and the animals, they're still here because I kept a promise. Your great-uncle Jeremiah made me swear I'd hold on until the rightful heir came. That was you. Always was. I thought I'd have more time, but the chest pain came back hard last winter. Still, I did what I could. Patched what I could. Fed who I could. Every sunrise, I told myself to hold on one more day. This place, it isn't just land. It's memory. It's duty. It's healing if you let it be. Your uncle believed that. So did I. Now it's your turn. Miguel 10 Bears. Tavian stared at the words until they blurred. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand and leaned back the chair, creaking beneath him. Miguel had lived in this cabin alone, carried the weight of this ranch on his back. For how long? A year too longer. Tavian stood and walked the small space. A basin by the window still held traces of soap. The stove was swept clean. Shelves lined with tins, herbs, teas, a few cans of beans. Everything orderly ready. Miguel hadn't run. He'd prepared for this. On the far wall, a second ledger hung from a rusted nail. He pulled it down. Inside were feeding schedules, rainfall records, even planting notes from years past. Miguel had kept every detail as if someone would come needing the full story, as if he believed someone would come at all. Tavian turned the last page. There was a note scrawled in the bottom corner. She watches you. Trust her. His stomach clenched. He stepped outside into the darkening dusk. Belle stood at the edge of the grove. Beyond her, the last of the light caught the edges of the broken barn roof and the silvered rails of the fence. The air was thick with night sounds, crickets, a soft rustle in the trees, the far-off call of a coyote. Tavian said aloud, voice barely above a whisper. He thought of the woman he'd seen that morning at the tree line, just standing, watching. He hadn't imagined her. The prints by the lower pen had been real. Boots narrow. Not Miguel's. Someone else. Belle whinnied softly and turned toward the cabin as if to say, You saw her. I did too. Tavian lingered on the porch until full dark. The stars stretched wide overhead, clearer here than he'd seen in years. He breathed in slow. The land smelled dry but not dead. Resting. Waiting. He slept that night in the cabin. Not well, not long, but deeply enough that he woke disoriented when Belle's hooves clacked across the stones outside. She snorted once, a sharp huff of air, and Tavian sat up blinking against the pale morning. Smoke. He smelled it before he saw it. Not fire-cook smoke. He grabbed his coat and stepped out barefoot into the cold dirt. It came from the far slope toward the northern rise, thin and blue coiling up between the trees. He didn't saddle up, just pulled on his boots and walked fast but quiet, letting the morning mist and the crunch of frost-dried grass guide his steps. Half a mile out, tucked under a low rock outcrop, he found it. A small fire, a blackened coffee pot set over the flame, and beside it, a woman. She didn't move when he appeared, just looked up slowly, her eyes steady. Dark hair braided back a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. He stopped 10 yards away. "You're not lost," he said. "No," she answered. "You were watching me. I was watching the ranch." Silence sat between them. "I'm Tavian Natani," he said finally. "I know." That hit like a jolt. He stepped forward, then paused. Her eyes stayed on his, unreadable, but not hostile. She nodded toward the fire. "Coffee's ready. Sit if you want." He hesitated, then moved forward and took the offered place on a rock. The fire crackled between them. She poured into a tin cup and handed it over. "I'm Elsie Yazzie," she said. "I knew your wife." The cup paused halfway to his mouth. The steam rose into his face and he blinked hard. "She talked about you," Elsie continued. "In the clinic, back before she passed. Said if she couldn't make it home, she hoped someone else could." Tavian lowered the cup slowly. "You're the one who gave her the herbs. For the pain." Elsie nodded. "And for the dreams." They sat in silence as the sun crawled over the hill, gold light catching on frost and turning everything to fire. "She wanted this place to mean something," Tavian said. "To heal." Elsie looked out across the valley toward the barn and the house and the waiting herd. "Then you're in the right place," she said. "But you're not doing it alone." Tavian didn't answer, didn't need to. The fire cracked, and above them a hawk circled, screaming once into the clean sky. "You may have lost her, Tavian, but this land hasn't." Tavian stood in the shadow of the barn as the morning burned away the frost. The herd had already moved out to the open pasture beyond the pens, slower than healthy animals, but still moving. The chickens followed in a loose scatter of feather and dust. He watched Belle nudge one of the younger mares toward the water trough. She moved like a guardian, never loud, never rushed, but always in the right place. He'd fed them again at sunrise, measured out the remaining grain from Miguel's last stash, and broke up the mineral blocks into smaller pieces. It wouldn't last long. A week if he rationed it tight, maybe less. His hands were raw from the cold, one knuckle split open and weeping slightly. He wiped it against his coat and went back to the side of the barn where he'd pulled a length of broken fence down earlier. He meant to rebuild it. Meant to get the pen secure before any of the younger animals wandered too far. But the wire was old, rusted into curls that bit his palms, and he was already tired. "You're doing it the hard way." He turned. Elsie stood behind him, a worn leather satchel over one shoulder, the same shawl wrapped tight against the wind. Her boots were dusty, her braid tied high. She carried herself like someone used to, standing still for long stretches, like she had time but expected others not to waste it. "You came back," he said. "I never left far," she replied, stepping closer. "I figured you'd need help by today." Tavian raised an eyebrow. "How'd you figure that?" "Because I knew Miguel, and I knew Ilani. And neither of them would have trusted a man who wouldn't try." She walked past him and dropped her satchel at the edge of the fence. From it she pulled a tin box of tools, a handful of cedar twigs, and a small pouch of powdered clay. Without asking, she knelt at the base of one of the fence posts and began packing the earth. Tavian watched her a moment, then bent to join her. They worked in silence for a while. He lifted the post. She measured the depth. He held it steady. She packed it with clay and rock. The wind picked up, but they moved like people who'd done this before, even if not together. The barn creaked in the gusts. A hawk passed overhead. "You knew Ilani well?" Tavian asked, finally breaking the quiet. Elsie nodded, brushing dirt from her palms. "We grew up near each other. I taught her the roots, how to make teas that don't taste like poison. She always said she wanted a place for animals no one else wanted. Said she had dreams like horses, beautiful but restless." Tavian felt something shift behind his ribs. "She wrote it down," he said, "in her journal. About this place. Said the land could heal if someone gave it a chance." Elsie looked up at him. She was right. They worked through midday, repaired 3 sections of fence, fed the smaller animals some of the herbs Elsie had brought: burdock for digestion, yarrow for wound, cedar for the restless ones. By the time the sun dipped past the far ridge, Tavian's arms were trembling and his back ached, but the pens held and the animals had eaten. He hadn't seen them lie down in the sun since he arrived. Now a few had begun to do just that. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve, then leaned on the fence. Elsie was near the old tack shed sorting through Miguel's medicine tins. She held up one with a faded label and whistled. "He saved this," she said. "Good batch of willow tincture. Strong pain medicine. Expired, sure, but it'll still work." She handed it to Tavian. Their fingers touched briefly. "This was your calling too," she said. "You just didn't know it yet." "I still don't," he admitted. Elsie nodded. "That's fine." Neither did Miguel. He figured it out one day at a time, usually by doing the wrong thing first. Tavian laughed once, short and surprised. He looked out at the pasture where Belle now stood, watching the herd like a sentinel. "She never leaves them." "No," Elsie said. "She's the anchor. Miguel said she took over after the last stallion died. The others follow her. If Belle falls, the whole place comes apart." Tavian stared for a long moment. The mare turned her head, sensing him maybe. She didn't move. "I'll go into town tomorrow," he said quietly. "See what feed I can get. This won't hold much longer." "You're going to need more than feed," Elsie said. "You're going to need help. I don't have money. You've got land. You've got animals. You've got hands." She picked up her satchel. "And I'll help where I can." He nodded. Words caught in his throat. As she walked away, he called out after her, "Why are you really helping?" She stopped, looked back. "Because you may have lost her, Tavian, but this land hasn't. And maybe it still remembers how to bring her back to you." He stood there long after she left, until the night came and the animals bedded down. Inside the barn, he found the old lantern, lit it, and sat near the feed barrels. He opened Ilani's journal again and read a passage he didn't remember seeing before. "I hope he forgives the world. I hope the sky stays wide enough to carry him. And I hope someone shows up with cedar and strong hands when I'm gone." Tavian closed the book, the weight of it solid in his lap. The next morning, just before sunrise, he fed the herd with what was left. The wind had died down, and the frost was light. He saddled the mare Chenoa, one of the younger ones, since Belle wouldn't leave the others, and packed a small bag. A jar of tincture. The ledger Miguel had kept. A note with the names of the animals he thought needed the most. He mounted and started toward Cortez. The trail was long, but he knew it now. Behind him, Belle stood at the gate, unmoving, waiting. They saw a Navajo man with too much land and too many animals, nothing more. The road into Cortez was harder than Tavian remembered. The trail was rutted and bone-dry dust, thick in the air, the kind that clung to your teeth. He rode Chenoa slow through the early light, saddle creaking beneath him, his pack bouncing softly against his hip with each step. She was still young, but she handled the miles well. Didn't spook, didn't pull. Still, Tavian felt the weight. The wind carried the scent of smoke and horses and that faint bitterness of town before you ever saw it. Coal stoves, garbage pits, too many people pretending they weren't all trying to outlast the same winter. By the time he crested the last hill, the sun was high. Cortez shimmered in the distance rows of squat buildings, wooden signs, and the tall white steeple of the church, stabbing upward like a warning. He passed the first houses, slow, nodding at a woman hanging laundry. She didn't nod back, just stared until he rode out of view. At the general store, he tied Chenoa to the post, patted her flank, and stepped inside. The bell over the door clanged sharp. The room quieted. 3 men at the counter looked up from their coffee. One leaned back in his chair, boots propped on a crate of flour sacks, squinting at Tavian like he was deciding whether to say something. Behind the counter, the storekeeper stood stiff, jaw tight. Tavian stepped forward, unrolling the list he'd scribbled that morning. Need coarse feed, salt blocks, some liniment if you've got any left, and vaccinations if you sell 'em. The storekeeper's face twitched. You a vet, no, Tavian said. But I've got animals that'll die if they don't get help. How many animals we talkin'? Tavian looked up. Over 200. The man let out a low whistle. One of the men by the counter sat forward. That's so you buy a cattle operation without telling anyone. No, Tavian said, keeping his voice even. Inherited a ranch north of here. Black timber. It was my uncle's. The man grunted. Didn't know anyone was still up that way. Thought that place was empty. It was... mostly. The room stayed quiet too long. The storekeeper cleared his throat. Feed's not cheap. Not by the sack and especially not in bulk. You got money on you? I've got credit, Tavian said. Land deed and ledger. I'll have cash when I sell off the first of the season's calves. The storekeeper hesitated. Then someone else stepped into the room. Boots hit the floor, slow and deliberate. A uniform, a badge catching the light. Tavian turned to see a man maybe a few years younger than him, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with sharp eyes that took in the whole room at once. Everything all right here? The deputy asked. The storekeeper straightened fast. Deputy Redhorse! Just a sale. The man's eyes moved to Tavian. You're Natani, that's right. He nodded once. You're the one who showed up at Black Timber. Tavian tensed. You been out there? The deputy stepped forward. Not yet, but I've heard about it. Town's been talking, sick animals, big herd, no brand registration, no vet papers. Nobody's sure what's going on. Tavian crossed his arms. Nobody came to ask. Maybe. But folks don't like mysteries, especially the kind that smell like trouble. Tavian stepped forward slow. I didn't come here to cause anything. I came to get what I need to keep those animals alive. The deputy looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, Come with me. Tavian hesitated, glanced once at the storekeeper, then followed him outside. They walked past the feed bins, the rows of tin kettles and rusted tools. The air felt thick. Too many eyes from windows. Redhorse led him around the side of the building to a water pump. Drew out a tin cup, filled it, handed it over. Tavian drank. It was cool, clean. Your Navajo Redhorse asked, half Tavian said. Mother was Daine. Father was from the San Juan side. Name's Ray Redhorse. My family's Ute. Been here longer than Cortez has had wood walls. They stood quiet a moment, the only sound the pump creaking as it settled. I didn't expect to be noticed so fast, Tavian admitted. You ride into town with a face like yours asking for medicine and claiming 200 head of livestock. Folks are gonna take notice, Ray said. Tavian nodded. They saw a Navajo man with too much land and too many animals, nothing more. Ray didn't argue. He leaned against the wall, arms folded. Is it true about the herd? Tavian pulled Miguel's ledger from his coat and handed it over. Ray flipped through, frowning. Who wrote this, caretaker? Miguel 10 bears. He stayed long after he should have. Died trying to hold the place together. I only just got there. Ray closed the book, handed it back. You got a vet, only herbs and instinct. Ray scratched his chin. That's a problem. Town's already on edge. One sick animal, and they'll come up that mountain with more than questions. I don't need much, Tavian said. Just enough to treat the worst of them. Keep them stable until I figure out more. Ray looked at him for a long time, then nodded once. Store won't give you much without cash. But the feed mill on the West End has a broken axle on their supply wagon. You help fix it, I'll talk to 'em. Vouch for you, get you enough feed to last a week. Tavian's eyes narrowed. Why help me? Ray's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Because my grandfather knew Jeremiah. Said he was a stubborn bastard who didn't lie. Said that land used to mean something. Maybe it still does. Tavian nodded. Ray started walking. Fix the axle, keep your herd contained, and if anything dies, bury it deep. Don't let the scavengers stir up fear before you get a chance to prove you belong. Tavian looked back once toward the main street, watched the curtains fall in a window. He mounted Chenoa and turned her toward the mill. The sun was already beginning its slow descent, casting the town in long shadows. He rode on the ledger tucked against his chest, and a new name in his mind. One man who hadn't turned away. One thread to hold on to. For now. Sometimes the way you tell the truth is what makes it heard. The sky was barely gray when Tavian stepped into the barn, fingers still crusted with grease from the mill axle he'd helped repair the day before. Ray had kept his word. By sundown, a mule team had hauled up 4 sacks of feed and 2 blocks of salt stacked neatly just inside the fence. No handshakes, no welcome, just delivery and dust. But it was something. Bell greeted him with a soft nicker as he poured feed into the trough. The herd gathered without rush, a slow wave of bodies moving as one. Their ribs still showed, but their eyes were clearer. No longer dull, no longer waiting. He stepped around the bay mare, checked the hoof he'd wrapped 2 days back. No fresh swelling. She led him near without protest. Elsie arrived an hour later, her coat speckled with road dust, and a fresh-cut bundle of wild yarrow tied to her saddle. You look like you fought a wagon, she said, stepping down. Close, Tavian replied. Ray Redhorse sent me to earn my feed. Heard of him. She tied her horse beside the gate. Keeps to the edges like he doesn't know whether to serve the town or the land. He's watching, Tavian said. But he hasn't turned away. That's something. She untied the bundle. We've got 3 more with hoof rot. I brought soak and a salve. They worked the better part of the morning, moving from stall to pen-lifting hooves, cutting away rot, applying the mixture that smelled like vinegar and fire. Tavian learned by watching her hands, precise, steady, never rushed. The animals trusted her. He felt himself trusting her too in the quiet between instructions. As they worked, he told her about the trip to Cortez. About the storekeeper's silence, the eyes from every window, the way Ray stood between him and trouble without needing to say much. They're not ready to see you, as one of them, Elsie said. But they'll take your work. It's how it's always been. I'm not sure I want to be one of them, Tavian said. But I can't do this alone. Elsie straightened, brushed straw from her sleeves and looked at him fully. You're not. You've got me. You've got Ray for now. You've got Belle. That's your circle, even if it's small. Tavian nodded, then walked to the old tack room and brought out Miguel's ledger. He handed it to her. She sat on the edge of the feed barrel, flipping pages with care. He tracked everything she murmured. More than I expected. He believed someone would need to know, Tavian said. I've started a new one. I figure if I ever fall, someone else should have the thread. Elsie looked up. That's how you hold on to land. Not by owning it, by leaving a trail. By noon, the work slowed. They ate cornbread and dried apples on the barn steps, watching the chickens scratch under the porch, and the goats nose their way into the feed room again. Tavian leaned back against the railing, his legs aching in a way that felt earned. I was thinking about the cattle, he said. The weaker ones. I can't keep them all alive on prayer and pine needles. You'll need medicine, Elsie said. And probably a vet. They don't have one in Cortez anymore. Retired. Left with his daughter in spring. Elsie chewed slowly, then said, that explains it. I wondered why no one stepped up when word got out about Black Timber. They knew, Tavian said. They just didn't want to help. She looked at him. Then make them want to. He raised an eyebrow. Sometimes, she said, the way you tell the truth is what makes it heard. Tavian looked toward the ridge. Ray offered to ride out. Said he wanted to see the ranch for himself. He will, she said. And when he does, show him everything. Not just the good parts. The rot, the hunger, the risk. Show him what it costs to stay. He didn't answer. Just let the wind carry the silence between them. Later that afternoon, as Tavian was restacking feed bags in the barn, he saw Ray's silhouette break the ridge. The deputy rode slow, one hand on the reins, the other resting on the pommel. His horse, a tall chestnut with a scar on its hind flank, moved easy over the rocky trail. Ray dismounted just outside the gate. Belle met him there. She didn't spook, didn't shy. She stood in his path, her head low, her stance wide. Ray paused, letting her sniff his hand. Then he looked at Tavian. Mind showing me around? Tavian nodded. They moved through the pens, the barn, the creek line. Tavian explained how many were feeding now, how much they had left. He showed Ray the treatment notes. Elsie had kept the salve mixtures, the logs. He didn't hide the limp in the red cow's back leg or the weeping eye on one of the goats. He showed him the broken fence he hadn't yet fixed, the pen he'd closed off to keep a fevered calf separate. Ray listened more than he spoke. Took notes in a small black book. When they reached the ridge behind the house where the view stretched for miles, he stopped. Looks better than I expected, he said. It's not enough, Tavian replied. But it's alive. Ray nodded. I'll file my report. I'll say the animals are being managed, that there's feed on-site treatment happening, that the land's not a threat. You think that'll matter? Ray shrugged. Some will believe me, some won't. But it buys you time. Tavian looked down the slope toward the barn, where Belle now stood watching them from the fence line. I'll take it, he said. Ray turned to leave, then paused. People don't always want truth, he said. They want safety. They want stories that make them feel smart for staying afraid. But if you keep showing up, they'll have to see more than just your name. Tavian didn't answer. Didn't have to. He watched Ray ride off into the dimming light dust, trailing behind him like smoke. The wind picked up. The first real cold of evening settled into the hills. The animals gathered closer to the barn. The sky turned gold, then silver. And inside the house on a shelf Tavian hadn't checked, before a letter waited tucked behind an old map sealed with wax and marked with a name he hadn't spoken aloud in months. Ailani. Her birthday opened the lock. Her words broke me open. The letter sat in his hands, like it might burn through his skin. Tavian turned it over again. The seal was faint now, just a worn circle of wax, the edges crumbling under his thumb. Her name was written across the front in handwriting he knew as well as his own. Ailani Natani. He hadn't seen that name on paper since the day he signed the death certificate. For a long time he didn't move. Just sat on the floor of the ranch house, back against the wall, the silence pressing in around him. The sky outside had shifted to that low thunder gray that promised dry lightning, and the wind scraped across the porch like something pacing. He broke the seal. Inside wasn't a letter from Ailani, at least not in her hand. It was from Uncle Jeremiah, but it was about her. "Tavian, she wrote me." More than once. I didn't reply. At first I didn't think I had anything worth offering a woman like her. But she kept writing, and I started answering. Just a few lines at a time, then whole pages. She told me about your life together, about the child you lost before you even knew they existed. She never said it outright, but I could read between the lines. She wrote about hope like it was a horse she was trying to gentle, skittish, proud. She loved you with the kind of fire people mistake for light. You should know this ranch, this whole plan. It wasn't mine. It was hers. She sent me sketches, ideas, a layout for where the goats might roam, where to build the pens wide enough for horses with scars. She dreamed of a place where broken things didn't get thrown away. I didn't tell you while she was alive because I didn't think you'd believe it came from her and not from pity. But I knew. The way she wrote about it. She wanted you to build it. Even if she couldn't. There's more. It's not just feed and fences. In the barn behind the feed room wall, there's a false board. You'll find a safe there. It belonged to me, then her. Now you. Use the code her birthday. She believed you'd find it when you were ready. So do I. Don't waste it. Jeremiah Tavian read the letter twice, then again. His mouth was dry, throat tight, with something too big to name. His fingers trembled as he folded it back up. The air felt too close. He stood, heart thudding against his ribs, and walked out into the wind. The barn loomed ahead. Inside, the animals stirred, goats shifting in their stalls, the rustle of straw, the low grumble of a cow chewing slow. Belle lifted her head as he entered, but didn't rise. He crossed to the feed room. The walls had always seemed uneven. He'd noticed it when he'd first moved the barrels. One section had sounded different under his boots, hollow almost. Now he crouched, ran his fingers along the baseboard, pressing gently until one of the boards shifted under his hand. It pulled back with a groan. Behind it, a metal safe sat embedded into the wall beam. Old, black, heavy. Tavian sat back on his heels, breathing hard. He wiped his palms against his pants and reached for the dial. Ailani's birthday, October 14th. He spun the dial, 1410. The lock gave a soft click. His hand froze. Then slowly he turned the handle. Inside were documents, deeds, savings bonds, birth certificates. Bundled together was a thick envelope tied with a pale blue ribbon faded with time. He pulled it free. The envelope bulged with folded letters. He untied the ribbon and opened the first one. It was in Ailani's handwriting. Jeremiah. I know Tavian won't write, so I will. He's grieving in the only way he knows how, quietly, painfully pretending he's not. I don't know if he'll come back here after I'm gone, but I want to believe he will, and if he does, I want this ranch to be waiting for him. He'll try to keep walking, keep running, but he needs something to anchor him, something that doesn't ask him to pretend. Will you help me build that place, letter after letter? Some short, some long. All full of detail, ideas, sketches, notes about animal care, pasture rotation, barn repairs. But it was the last one that broke him. Jeremiah. If he ever finds this, don't tell him right away. Let him feel it on his own. Let him stand still long enough to hear the land talk back. He'll hate the silence at first, but that's where the healing hides. Also tell him I'm sorry. I didn't get to tell him about the baby. I wanted to. I was going to. But I was scared. And then it all happened so fast. Please tell him he would have been a good father. The best. He still can be. Maybe not to our child, but to something that needs him. Tavian dropped the letter, his chest caving in. The barn swam in his vision. He sat hard on the packed dirt floor, the letters scattered around him like leaves in a storm. His hands covered his face, and the sob escaped before he could stop it. Belle came to him. Her steps were slow, deliberate. She nudged his arm with her muzzle, then lowered herself beside him. Not close enough to crowd, but close enough to share her warmth. Tavian leaned into her and wept like the world had ended again. But it hadn't. Not this time. When he finally stood, the sky was dark and the stars had come out sharp and unflinching. He gathered the letters, folded them gently, returned them to the envelope, replaced the board in the wall, then he walked out into the night air. The ranch was quiet, but not still. The goats shifted, the horses sighed, a soft cluck from the hen roost. Life, ordinary, persistent. Tavian sat on the porch steps and pulled out the new ledger. He opened to a clean page. Day 12. Discovered the safe. Found her letters. She knew. She planned it all. I didn't lose everything. I just didn't understand what I was meant to keep. He closed the book. The wind swept across the pasture, and somewhere in the distance he saw flickers of light clouds passing over the moon, the flash of something far off. Smoke. Not from a chimney. From the trees. To the west. He stood. Watched. His eyes narrowed. Then he stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn. Belle met him at the gate. Waiting. The fire didn't ask if I was ready. It just came. By the time Tavian reached the ridge, the orange glow was unmistakable. Flames flickered low in the trees, just beneath the horizon, licking at the dry underbrush, like it had been waiting all summer for an invitation. Smoke rose in a dark ribbon stretching across the sky and bending with the wind. The air had changed sharper, heavy with the tang of pine resin and danger. The fire was moving fast. He turned and ran, feet pounding down the slope, heart thundering louder than his boots against the ground. The herd was still clustered near the barn, most of them bedded down, lulled by the calm night and the predictable rhythm of survival. Tavian burst into the yard, breath ragged. Belle raised her head first, sensing it before the others. Her ears snapped forward, body tense. He didn't wait. He ran to the shed, yanked the latch on the feed room, grabbed 2 halters and a coil of rope. Then to the porch where his saddlebags were still half-packed. He stuffed them with dried fruit, a knife, a tin of salve, and a flask of water. No time for anything else. Smoke already threaded through the trees behind the house. He whistled sharp and low. Belle trotted to him. He threw the halter over her head and cinched it tight. Not running, he muttered. We're moving smart, calm. But the fire didn't care about smart. It didn't care about planning. It just came. He turned Belle toward the south pasture where the creek cut through the land like a shallow scar. If they moved fast enough, they could reach the low flats before the fire hit the ridge. He ran to the barn and threw open the gate, whistling again, louder now. The herd stirred, hooves clattering against dirt and wood eyes rolling white in the moonlight. The smoke hit them then, just a breath of it, but enough to change everything. The animals began to panic. Tavian moved between them, arms out, calling low in Diné voice, steady even though his pulse was not. Easy. Move together. Stay low. Come on. It was Belle who led them. She trotted through the gate, then paused and turned, looking back. One by one, the others followed. Not fast, but moving. Tavian mounted her bareback and rode ahead, guiding them toward the creek. Fire glowed behind them, now turning the treetops into lanterns, casting strange shadows across the land. Embers danced in the wind. He didn't look back again. They reached the far pasture as the first wave of heat licked over the hill behind them. The creek ran low but wide enough. He moved the animals into the bend, using the water and damp grass as a barrier. He counted as best he could, 30, 40 more still coming. He saw Elsie then riding down from the northern trail on a paint gelding, her braid whipping behind her face, lit by the firelight. She didn't yell, didn't wave, just nodded once and rode to the far side of the herd, helping guide the stragglers in. Together, they moved them again closer to the water into tighter groups. Belle kept circling them like a watchdog, ears pinned back her chest, heaving. Tavian climbed down and splashed into the creek, boots sinking into the muck. He knelt by a calf that had collapsed, its breath coming too fast, too shallow. Smoke curled above them. Elsie was beside him. She's scared, not burned. Let her rest. The lungs will settle. How long do we have? Tavian asked. Elsie looked toward the trees. If the wind shifts west, we've got 2 hours. If it doesn't, maybe 1. Lightning cracked in the distance. Not rain, just threat. They moved the feed sacks to the far side of the creek, pulled the goats closer, dug out a shallow trench around the young ones. Tavian's hands bled from splinters and dry earth. He couldn't feel the tips of his fingers, but he kept going. They both did. When the flames reached the fence line, the sky turned copper. The air boiled. The barn caught. It happened without sound at first, just a rush of heat and a sudden bloom of light. Then the wood screamed a groan deep in its bones as the roof fell inward. Tavian turned to look just once. Saw it collapse. Saw the last home Miguel built turn to ash in seconds. He turned away. Belle stood chest deep in the creek water, up to her knees, watching. The fire didn't jump the creek. It curled against the banks, roaring like a thing alive, then fell back, starved for fuel. By dawn it had passed. Smoke hung low, hiding the sun. Everything smelled scorched and tired. The house was gone. The barn, most of the fencing. But the herd stood. Elsie sat on a rock, her face streaked with ash, eyes red. Tavian walked over to her and sat beside her. Neither spoke. Belle waded out of the creek and shook water flying from her mane. She walked over and pressed her head into Tavian's shoulder. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the light was changing. Real sunlight pushing through. "You lost a lot," Elsie said quietly. Tavian nodded, but not everything. She handed him the small tin she'd saved from her pack. Inside, still sealed, was the cedar salve. "Start with this," she said. "Then rebuild." He took it with shaking hands. Later that day, they buried what couldn't be saved. A goat with singed lungs, a cow that didn't wake. Tavian stacked stones around the grave. Quiet, careful, like he was arranging memory itself. That night, under a black sky pricked with stars, Tavian sat with Belle beside what was left of the porch steps. The earth was still warm, but the worst had passed. He opened Ilani's journal. A page he hadn't noticed before tucked near the back. "If fire comes, remember it doesn't burn what you are. It only clears the way." He closed the book, looked at the ruins, then at the animals settling once more. And he believed her. "I didn't save them. They saved me." The schoolhouse was already full when Tavian rode into town. Chenoa's hooves echoed against the boardwalk, and a few heads turned as he passed. The smell of smoke clung to him, still in his coat, still tangled in his hair, even after a full day of wind and creek water. He didn't try to hide it. Let them smell it. Let them see what it cost to hold on. Ray stood at the steps, arms folded across his chest badge glinting under the porch lantern. He gave a slow nod. "You're late," he said. "I was rebuilding a fence," Tavian replied. Ray looked him over. "You bring anything?" Tavian patted the satchel slung across his shoulder. "Health logs, photos, test results from the vet in Mancos." Ray stepped aside. "Good. You'll need all of it." Inside the room buzzed with low murmurs like a storm waiting for permission to break. Wooden benches filled with ranchers, townsfolk, council members. At the front sat Mayor Hollis, his silver hair combed back tight, the same green tie he wore at every public gathering like a signal flag. Elsie was already there, seated near the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She gave him a look, calm, steady, don't flinch. Tavian removed his hat, walked to the center of the room, and stood before the crowd. Mayor Hollis cleared his throat. "Mr. Natani, you've been called here tonight to respond to multiple community concerns regarding Black Timber Ranch. These include, but are not limited to livestock containment, fire hazard, disease control, and the general impact of your operation on the surrounding area." Tavian nodded. "Understood. You may present your statement." He glanced around the room, saw the faces skeptical, curious, closed. Some he recognized from the general store. Some he didn't. No one smiled. He reached into the satchel and pulled out Miguel's ledger. "This belonged to the man who held that ranch together before me," he said. "Miguel 10 Bears. He wasn't paid, wasn't family. But he stayed. For years. He kept these animals alive when no one else would." He held it up. Every feed schedule, every medical note, every rainfall. He wrote it all down. Because he believed someone would come back, he set the book down gently. "I didn't know I was coming back. When I arrived, I was grieving, angry. I didn't want a ranch. I didn't want anything. I thought I was just the last name on a deed." He paused. "But then I saw them. Not just alive waiting. Belle the gray mare, she stepped forward first. She knew, they all did. That land hadn't been abandoned. It had been enduring." He pulled out the second ledger, his own, and opened it. "These are my records. The vet in Mancos came out 3 days before the fire. No major infections. No outbreak risks. I've got receipts for vaccines, treatment logs, photos of the injuries before and after. Most of those animals are healing." He looked out across the room. "You're worried about fire, disease, damage. I get it. But the fire didn't start on my land. It came from the west, through federal grazing territory, and we held it off. Me, Elsie, Belle. That mare led the herd down to the creek and stood guard while I dug trenches. Someone near the back scoffed. 'You expect us to believe a horse saved a ranch?' Tavian looked at the man. 'No. I expect you to understand that survival doesn't look the way you want it to. It looks like mud and blood and someone staying up all night with a fevered calf because they don't know how to let go again.' His voice broke slightly. 'I didn't save them. They saved me.' Silence settled. Then the mayor leaned forward. 'And what do you intend to do going forward?' Tavian took a breath. 'Rebuild. Fix the fences. Rotate pasture to avoid overgrazing. Bring in students from the reservation to help learn animal care. Open the land to elders who want to pass on what they know. This isn't just a ranch. It's a sanctuary. For them, for others. For anyone who needs a place to land when everything else gives out.' The murmurs grew louder. Some murmurs of approval, others of doubt. Ray stepped forward. 'I've been to Black Timber. I've seen the conditions, and the truth is I expected chaos. But what I found was a system. Imperfect, sure, but healing. The fire didn't destroy it. It revealed what was underneath. He looked at the mayor. My recommendation is to allow it to continue under probationary review, quarterly checks, vet verification. But don't shut it down. Mayor Hollis leaned back. Very well. We'll take this to vote. One by one, hands went up. At first, just a few, then more. When the count finished, the mayor nodded. Majority in favor. Black Timber Ranch will continue operations under monitored status. Tavian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. As the crowd began to stir, a small voice piped up near the front. I like brushing the horses. A boy stood near his mother, maybe 8 years old, clutching a worn hat in both hands. Tavian blinked. The boy stepped forward. Mr. Natani let me help feed the chickens. He told me their names. One of them sits on my shoulder sometimes. A few chuckles, soft ones. Another child stood. He showed me how to clean hooves, said it's like picking out a stone from your own shoe. Then an older man, with hands like bark and eyes the color of dry sky, raised his voice. That land's seen more storms than all of us. If it's still standing, maybe we ought to leave it be. Tavian looked at them all. The room had changed. Not everyone, but enough. Outside, the wind had shifted. Cooler now. Clean. He stepped onto the porch and breathed it in. Elsie joined him a moment later. You did it, she said. No, Tavian replied. They did. She smiled just a little. Still got a winter ahead. I know. He looked toward the mountains. But now I've got help. The door opened behind them. Ray stepped out, hands in his pockets. There's a woman from the Denver Animal Board coming next month. I suggested she come meet the mayor. She'll like Tavian said. Ray nodded. She won't have a choice. They all stood there a moment, listening to the town wind down the night, pressing close. And in that quiet, Tavian felt something shift inside him. Not an ending, a beginning. She dreamed of this. I just had to live long enough to build it. The wind was warm that morning, the kind that rolled off the mesas, slow, steady, and full of memory. It smelled like ash and new grass, like something old giving way to something alive again. Tavian stood at the edge of the pasture, the rebuilt fence firm beneath his hands. His palms were rough, scabbed from weeks of work. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. His knees ached, but he didn't care. He watched the herd move across the field like a slow tide, heads down, tails flicking. Belle walked at the edge as always, steady as a shadow. Behind him, the ranch was changing. The barn had been half raised, already new beams notched into old foundations, the scent of fresh-cut lumber mingling with the memory of smoke. Volunteers from the nearby reservation had come out with tools and supplies. Even 2 of the town's ranchers had shown up unannounced, wordlessly offering help, hammering side by side with the same people they'd once eyed with suspicion. A new well had been dug deeper than the last. A water tank stood gleaming in the sun. The chicken coop was rebuilt with clean pine and chicken wire that didn't sag. Elsie had painted it red for luck, she said, though Tavian figured it was just the only paint the town hardware store would give them for free. And then there were the kids. He could hear them now laughing near the goat pen, arguing about names and whose turn it was to clean the troughs. One boy had named a lamb after his favorite comic book hero. Another had written princess on the feed bucket and refused to explain why. It made Tavian smile in a way he hadn't in years, deep without flinching. Inside the ranch house, what was left of it, a new roof stretched over the kitchen and back room. The rest would take time. But the heart of it had been reclaimed. The fireplace had been cleaned out. The floor scrubbed. Ilani's journal sat open on the table, a smooth stone laid across the pages to hold them down in the breeze. Tavian walked through the pasture gate boots, pressing new paths into old dirt. He passed the watering station, where Ray had installed a gravity-fed system. Simple, smart, reliable. Ray had become something of a fixture now, riding out twice a week, sometimes more. He never announced himself, just showed up, fixed something, and rode off again. Said little, asked nothing. But he stayed. Elsie stood near the new garden beds planting herbs with a young girl who looked up at her like she held the answers to the universe. "She's a good listener," Elsie said when Tavian joined her. "Learns fast," he replied. "Reminds me of someone I used to know." He looked at her, and she smiled without needing to explain. Tavian knelt, pulled weeds, pressed his hands into the soil. It was darker than he remembered, richer, full of roots. It smelled like the beginning of something. "She dreamed of this," he said, voice low. "I just had to live long enough to build it." Elsie said nothing, just kept planting. That evening, as the sun slid low and gold across the horizon, Tavian climbed the ridge behind the ranch. Belle followed without command, walking behind him like she understood. At the top, he stopped. Below him, the sanctuary pulsed with life. Children ran between sheds, their laughter rising like birdsong. Chickens roosted on the fence rail. A boy sat with a sleeping goat in his lap, rocking slightly. Elsie was gathering up the last of the tools, her braids swinging with each step. Tavian let the silence wash over him. Then he turned and looked east. Far in the distance, the road curved toward the foothills. Beyond that, the cemetery on the edge of White Mesa, where Ilani rested beneath a cottonwood tree. He hadn't gone since the fire. He hadn't been ready. But now he reached for the saddle. It was time. The ride was long, quiet. The trees stood still. The earth hummed. At the grave, he dismounted and walked to her stone. Someone, maybe Elsie, had left fresh cedar tied with twine at the base. The wind moved through the branches above, rustling the leaves like breath. Tavian crouched and placed a folded letter against the stone. Inside were pages from the ledger, a photo one of the children had drawn of Belle, and a pressed bloom from the garden. He didn't speak, just let the silence hold them both. Then softly, "It's happening. Just like you said it could." He stayed until the light turned blue, then mounted and rode back under the first stars. When he crested the ridge again, the ranch glowed with lanterns. Belle walked ahead of him, now leading the way. He let her. And when they reached the gate, a new sign hung there. Fresh wood, hand-carved, clean lines. White Mesa Sanctuary for the broken, for the healed, for those still finding the trail. Tavian stopped beneath it, laid a hand on the wood. Behind him, the sounds of the ranch carried into the night, hooves and dirt, laughter, low voices preparing for sleep. He stepped forward. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. Not every story ends with a gun or a grave. Some just go quiet and full. Snow came early that year, not the kind that drifts lazy and light, but thick, sure flakes that covered the land in silence. The wind blew across White Mesa with a hush, muffling the usual sounds of hooves and hammering and children's voices. The sky had held that heavy silver hue since dawn, like it was waiting for something to break. Tavian stood on the porch, mug in his hand, steam curling into the cold. Belle grazed near the paddock gate, her coat thick with winter fur snow piling gently across her back. She didn't seem to notice. She rarely minded storms. She'd lived through worse. The sanctuary had settled. The garden was asleep, beds covered with straw and pine boughs. The barn, now whole again, stood solid against the slope, smoke curling from its new chimney. A few of the goats huddled in the corner pen, pressed tight for warmth, their breath fogging the air. Inside the house, the fire snapped quietly. The children weren't there. School had taken them back for the season, but their drawings still lined the wall. One of Belle mid-gallop, another of Tavian with a sun for a face. He left them up. The ranch felt too still without them. Ray had stopped by the day before, brought more fencing wire and a sack of flour. He hadn't stayed long, just long enough to fix the broken hinge on the goat pen and say there'd be a community dinner in a week. "You'll come," he said, not asked. Tavian had nodded, and Ray, in his usual way, left without waiting for confirmation. Elsie had gone to check on her mother across the state line. Said she'd be back by week's end. She left a tin of biscuits and 2 jars of preserved peaches by the stove. Tavian hadn't touched them yet. He was waiting until the snow really hit. She always said food tasted better when the world closed in. The silence deepened as the flakes thickened, covering hoofprints, softening everything they'd built. Tavian watched it fall for a long time. Then he went inside. On the kitchen table sat the 3rd ledger, the one he'd started after the fire. He flipped it open, hands worn smooth from cold and work. He wrote slowly, deliberately. Day 242. First snow. All accounted for. Fence line held. Roof didn't leak. Belle's hoof fully healed. He paused, the pen tip resting just above the paper. Sanctuary feels earned now. Not given, not borrowed. Ours. He closed the book gently, as if not to wake something sleeping nearby. Later, he walked the grounds, boots crunching fresh snow. He checked the gate, shook snow from the chicken coop roof, spread fresh hay in the shelters. By the time he returned to the porch, his shoulders were dusted in white, and his cheeks burned from the cold. He sat. There wasn't much to fix that day. That in itself felt strange. The old Tavian would have gone searching for something broken, anything to patch or bend or rebuild. But now he let stillness sit beside him. Let it breathe. Let it stay. Belle wandered over, nosing his sleeve. He rubbed her muzzle, slow and quiet. "You did good," he said. "You kept us going." She blinked, then moved on, tail swishing gently. He sat there until the sun slipped behind the ridge, the last light turning the snow to gold. The kind of light Ailani used to call the soft edge of the day. Inside, the fire had burned low. He stoked it, added a log, then reached for the drawer near the hearth. From it, he pulled the last of her letters. Not to Jeremiah. This one was to him. She'd written it before the illness, tucked it in an envelope marked, "Only when ready." He had never read it, had never even unfolded it. Now he did. "Tavian, I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in echoes. You were never meant to stay in one place long. That's what I loved about you. You were always moving, chasing, fixing. But I hope someday you find a place that holds you as much as you hold it. This land, I see it in your hands. I see it in the way you watch animals like they're telling you something. I see it in the way you fall quiet when the wind shifts. You belong somewhere, even if you don't believe that yet. If you're reading this, then maybe you stayed. Maybe you stopped running. And if you did, thank you. Not just for me, but for whatever's come from it. Keep it going even if it's hard. Especially then. Love always, A." He sat with the letter a long time, firelight dancing across the ink. Then he folded it, returned it to the envelope, and placed it in the ledger between today's entry and the blank page that followed. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just felt full. Outside, the snow kept falling. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped once, then settled. Wind creaked through the shutters, slow and old. The scent of pine and smoke filled the room. Tavian stood. He went to the porch, pulled on his coat, and walked out into the soft dark. The stars blinked above him, the kind of sky that made you feel small in the right way. Belle lifted her head, watched him, then satisfied turned back to the fence line where the snow had erased every sign of the day before. He walked the pasture once more, not checking, just being. He reached the gate, leaned on it, and looked out over the land. Sanctuary. Not a place, really. A promise kept. A life reclaimed. A silence earned. Not every story ends with a gun or a grave. Some just go quiet and full, and keep going. The educational lesson learned from this story is that grief doesn't always ask to be fixed. Sometimes it asks us to stay care and keep showing up. Purpose can return quietly through responsibility routine and tending to something that depends on us even when we feel worn down ourselves. Life doesn't always give second chances in the form we expect, but it often offers them in the shape of work worth doing and people or creatures worth caring for. And in the end, healing isn't about erasing loss, but about building something steady enough to carry it forward.